A deal brokered by Qatar is reached to provide medicines for hostages held in Gaza by Hamas. In return, Israel will allow more basic supplies into Gaza. Foreign Minister Penny Wong continues her Middle East visit in Israel, reaffirming Australia's solidarity with Israel, but cautioning the war in Gaza needs to be in line with humanitarian law. A fiery address by North Korea's leader saying unification of the Korean peninsula is no longer possible. And the world's largest iceberg on the move, and it's melting as it drifts away from the Antarctic. I'm Catalina Florez. This is SBS World News. Good evening. Israel and Hamas have reached a deal to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza, according to Qatari mediators. Medicines will be given to hostages held by Hamas. In return, Israel will allow more basic supplies into Gaza, where the UN says every single person is hungry.
More than 1 million Palestinians are packed into the small southern town of Rafah. The lines for food take hours. The payoff, paltry.
باجي على التكييم الساعة 9 بقعد من الساعة 9 للساعة 12 للساعة 12 بضلني باخذ الطبيخ لأولادي وبروح إشي بياكل وإشي ما بياكل.
A deal between Israel and Hamas will see aid leave Doha on Wednesday and delivered to civilians in the most affected and vulnerable areas, according to Qatari negotiators. A team of UN special rapporteurs say there's no place in the strip it's not needed, adding that Israel is destroying the food system and weaponizing hunger.
الجسم كله ركبه المرض، ولادي مرضى من قلة الأكل. هذه ما بتكفي، إيش بدها تكفي هذه؟ بتكفيش نفرين. هذه بدها تكفي 7 أنفار غدا وبتكفيش غدا، بس غدا وجبة واحدة بتكفيش.
The agreement includes medicines, which will be given to hostages held by Hamas. The Israeli Prime Minister's office says a list of the types of medications needed has been compiled based on medical records and information from families.
Bring them home now.
The US, hopeful lines of communication will stay open and lead to the release of more captives. Paris, playing a role in the deal, also pushing.
Donc nous allons poursuivre les initiatives diplomatiques, résolutions, discussions.
On the ground, some of the most intense combat since the New Year. In northern Gaza, tanks rolled in and smoke filled skies. Rare sight since Israel announced a transition to smaller operations there. Hamas firing around 25 rockets at Israel, its biggest barrage in weeks. Still small compared to the early days of war. With 158 Palestinians killed in the last 24 hours, according to Gazan health officials, the international calls for a ceasefire continue.
We can only reach a ceasefire if both sides are ready that the suffering for oneself also ends the suffering from the others.
Continuing as we are now, continuing to see the suffering that's happening in Gaza is likely to lead to continuing cycles of escalation.
Qatari mediators say they're pressing on with negotiations. Liz Maddock, SBS World News.
Foreign Minister Penny Wong has cautioned Israel over humanitarian concerns in Gaza, urging Israel to take steps towards a ceasefire. The minister met with her Israeli counterpart, as well as Israel's president and families of hostages after her visit to Jordan, where she announced $21.5 million in aid to Palestinians affected by the conflict in the region. Ms Wong said she reaffirms Australia's continued solidarity with Israel and reiterated again condemnation of the attacks of 7th of October. But she cautioned the war in Gaza needs to be in line with humanitarian law.
We do use our voice internationally to continue to advocate and encourage a pathway to peace, because we do want a future in which the Israeli people can live in peace and security, and so too the Palestinian people.
Penny Wong will tomorrow meet with officials in the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as representatives of communities affected by settler violence, before heading to the United Arab Emirates. The US has made good on its threat to punish more Houthi attacks with further strikes on Yemen, taking out more of the rebels' military power in the middle of the night. But the Houthis remain undeterred, claiming another direct hit today on a bulk carrier bound for Israel.
In the face of America's military might, the Houthis are defiant, taking their supporters on a tour of the Japanese Galaxy Leader, the ship they seized 60 days ago.
رسالتنا للعدو الأمريكي الإسرائيلي إنه مهما حصل من تحديات في البحر الأحمر ومهما عمل من إجراءات تعسفية ضد القوات البحرية اليمنية فهذا لن يخيفنا ولن يرهبنا ولن يوقف من عزمنا وصلابتنا تجاه موقفنا تجاه القضية الفلسطينية.
The next challenge wasn't far off. The US striking and destroying 4 anti-ship ballistic missiles stationed in Yemen. But the Houthis are still firing. Less than 10 hours later, a Greek-owned bulk carrier was en route from Vietnam to Israel when it was hit with an anti-ship ballistic missile in the Red Sea. The ship was carrying 24 crew members but no cargo. It sustained limited damage but remains seaworthy and is continuing on its journey.
إن القوات المسلحة اليمنية مستمرة في تنفيذ قرار منع الملاحة الإسرائيلية أو المرتبطة بالعدو الإسرائيلي.
The US says it's intercepted weapons bound for Yemen, revealing Navy SEALs seized this ship last week. On board, they found Iranian-made missile components. 2 SEALs were lost at sea during the operation.
We did not say when we launched our attacks, they're going to end once and for all. The Houthis will be fully deterred. We anticipated the Houthis would continue to try to hold this critical artery at risk, and we continue to reserve the right to take further action.
Regional mediator Qatar cautioning against tit-for-tat retaliations.
Military resolution will not bring an end for this, will not contain it. It's the contrary. Whatever the retaliation is, the attacks are just continuing. The response on the Houthis' attack, it resulted with another attack yesterday. And it's just going to grow.
A coalition of 23 aid groups say they're beginning to suspend their operations in Yemen due to safety concerns over the strikes. In a joint statement saying political leaders must consider the dire humanitarian implications of military escalation and refrain from actions that could result in renewed large-scale armed conflict in Yemen. Already in one of the world's biggest humanitarian crises, 2/3 of Yemenis rely on aid to survive. Claudia Farhat, SBS World News.
Pakistan has summoned Iran's senior diplomat to protest against what it says was an unprovoked violation of its airspace in which 2 children were killed and several others injured after Iran launched strikes targeting what it described as bases for the militant group Jaish al-Adl. It's the 3rd country to be hit by an Iranian attack in recent days after Iraq and Syria were targeted less than a day earlier. The strike hit a village in the southwestern province of Balochistan, which borders the 2 countries. In a statement, a spokesperson for Pakistan's foreign ministry condemned the attacks, saying this violation of Pakistan's sovereignty is completely unacceptable and can have serious consequences. Kurdish Prime Minister Masroor Barzani also condemning the attacks in Iraq, labelling it unjustifiable and cowardly. Earlier this week, Iran fired missiles at what it claimed were Israeli spy headquarters in Erbil in the Kurdish region of the country. The attacks, which left 4 people dead and 6 more injured, sparked a protest outside the city's UN headquarters. Mauritius has lifted its highest weather alert, easing a nationwide curfew that was imposed after a deadly cyclone battered the island. Cyclone Belal ripped through the capital and other parts of the country earlier this week, causing heavy flooding and extensive damage. 1 person died in Mauritius. Another 2 bodies were found in the nearby French island of Réunion. Fresh off the back of his landslide Iowa caucus's win, Donald Trump was back in court. It was the first day of a second defamation trial, with a New York jury being selected to determine damages the former US president must pay to writer E. Jean Carroll. Mr. Trump denies all accusations.
Dividing his time between the courtroom and the campaign trail, the former president in New York for a second civil defamation trial.
Thank you. Thank you.
brought on by writer Jean Carroll, who accuses him of damaging her reputation through defamatory statements made in 2019 regarding her sexual assault allegations. The former US president was found liable for sexual abuse and defamation in a separate case last year, the verdict carrying over to this trial, which will determine damages. Jean Carroll's attorneys seeking $15 million. Mr. Trump says he wishes to testify.
Now, here's the bottom line in this case. President Trump is fully in his right to completely deny these false accusations.
But the judge has set strict boundaries, saying Mr. Trump is precluded from offering any testimony, evidence or argument suggesting or implying that he did not sexually assault Ms. Carroll or that she fabricated her account. The backdrop of the trial, the race for the Republican presidential nomination, Donald Trump with a resounding win in the first test in Iowa. But many see Super Tuesday on March 5th as the big test of the primary calendar, when 16 states vote.
All those contests are going to give us the pulse of the Republican electorate versus Iowa, which though it's first in the nation, again, we're looking at a very far-right component of today's GOP, which isn't entirely MAGA held.
New Hampshire is next, though, where Mr. Trump may face tougher competition.
You must go out and vote. Don't sit home and say, well, you know what, I love the president, but he's going to win by so much, because we have to show big margins.
Supporters braving freezing conditions as they lined up to hear from the former president. The challenge for the other candidates, galvanising their supporters too. Tanya Dandrinos, SBS World News.
China's ambassador to Australia has called for a resumption of joint military exercises with Australia and cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, declaring 2024 should be the year of deeper economic and strategic ties. But tensions in the relationship remain, in particular over Taiwan.
Hello.
Welcoming the new year and new opportunities.
To the friendship between China and Australia, cheers.
Toasting with a glass of Australian wine, still subject to Chinese trade tariffs. Sanctions, once worth $20 billion, have almost all been lifted, amid hopes last year's diplomatic stabilisation can make way for deeper strategic ties.
Defence relationship between two countries is an area really we need to put more input and work harder on.
Spruiking the possibility of multilateral Pacific partnerships and even joint military operations.
If you have trust between two militaries, you do have the real trust.
That trust tested last year when Australian divers were injured by sonar pulses off the coast of Japan. Beijing dismissing claims they came from a Chinese warship, now making this suggestion.
There was a third country boat nearby. Whether or not there was sonar from the other side, other party, we're not sure. Perhaps our Australian colleagues can find out.
Which country was that?
Japan.
I stand by the comments that we've made at the time.
The ambassador insisting the region is big enough for Australia and China to coexist. But the background of strategic competition remains. Just days ago, Nauru cut all official diplomatic ties with Taiwan. Nauru's President David A. Dang declaring the shift to a one China policy in his country's best interests. It came just days after Taiwan's presidential elections. The Democratic Progressive Party returned for a third term.
Taiwanese people choose democracy over authoritarian and choose the peaceful status quo rather than one country, two systems.
While the Australian government maintains a one China position, Labor has congratulated President Lai Ching-te, labelled a dangerous separatist by Beijing.
We are strongly opposed to such a statement.
We don't seek to be defined, the relationship with China, by our differences.
The ambassador seeking a meeting with Australian government officials in coming days. Sarah Tomevska, SBS World News.
Coming up next, President Zelenskyy calls on Western allies to step up aid to Ukraine in a passionate speech at the World Economic Forum. Peru reclaims hundreds of ancient pre-Hispanic artefacts, some more than 2,000 years old. And parents under pressure, how education costs are affecting household budgets. North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un has delivered a fiery address to his Workers' Party supporters, saying unification of the Korean peninsula is no longer possible. The speech seen as a major departure from previous summits. South Korea's president responded by promising his military was capable of an overwhelming response to any aggression.
The Supreme People's Assembly, where North Korea's two past leaders tower over the Grand Hall. The nation's third Supreme Leader now forging a new path, ending a decades-old policy. Kim Jong-un took what he described as a new stand on North-South relations.
We do not want war, but we also have no intention of avoiding it.
Kim's speech also called for a constitutional amendment.
It should be specified in our constitution that the Republic of Korea is our primary foe and invariable principal enemy.
The response from the South, immediate. President Yoon declared the North's regime as anti-national and ahistorical after it moved to define South Korea as a separate, hostile nation.
Our military is capable of an overwhelming response. Should North Korea provoke us, we will punish them multiple times harder.
South Korea, the United States and Japan have ramped up military exercises in the region. On Monday, North Korea said it tested a solid-fuel missile fitted with a hypersonic warhead, just a week after firing live ammunition towards a South Korean island. The rhetoric raising concerns that strengthening ties to Moscow and rising tensions globally may encourage the North Korean leader.
With the new rise of aggressive Russian policies and Chinese proactive attempt at unification by force emboldens North Korea to do the same with regards to the Republic of Korea in the south of the peninsula.
The dire situation in the vast bulk of the country also a concern for Kim, who devoted much of his speech to the inequality between city and rural populations. More than 10 million of its 26 million people are estimated by the World Food Programme to be undernourished. Taisok Husey, SBS World News.
Indigenous leaders in Guatemala have held a traditional Mayan ceremony for the inauguration of the 52nd President Bernardo Arevalo. Arevalo was sworn in as president on Monday despite months of efforts to derail his inauguration by the country's prosecutor. In the lead up to the ceremony, Indigenous Guatemalans had staged more than 100 days of protests in defence of democracy. More than 200 ancient pre-Hispanic artefacts have been reclaimed by Peru from collectors and institutions around the world. Some of the objects, ranging from ceramics to Indigenous art, are more than 2,000 years old, the oldest dating back to 200 BC. The returns are part of Peru's ongoing effort to reclaim its historical items, with more than 800 pieces repatriated in the last 2 years. Stranded tourists in a remote village in China have been evacuated after being trapped due to heavy snowfall triggered by avalanches. Local media said more than 1,000 tourists and residents were stranded in Hemu village in Xinjiang's Altai prefecture. Those injured were airlifted out by military helicopters while food and fuel supplies were flown in. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has called on Western allies to step up aid to Ukraine in a passionate speech at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. In the latest attack, 2 Russian missiles hit a residential area in Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv. The strike injuring 17 people, 2 of them seriously, and badly damaging homes. Mr. Zelenskyy is now asking for sanctions against Russia to be tightened, saying delays in funding for Kyiv could prolong the fighting by years.
At Davos, Volodymyr Zelenskyy is a man in demand, meeting foreign leaders and CEOs.
How did the meeting go, sir?
Very good. Thank you so much. Just the beginning of the meetings.
His big summit speech, a warning to the West, at a time when much of the world's attention has turned to the Middle East.
If anyone thinks this is only about us, this is only about Ukraine, they are fundamentally mistaken. Let me ask very honestly, which European nation today can provide a combat-ready army on par with ours, holding back Russia? And how many men and women are your nation ready to send to defend another state, another nation?
He thanked nations for putting sanctions on Russia, but warned they must be tightened because Moscow has created workarounds.
Putin loves money above all. The more billions he and his oligarchs, friends and accomplices lose, the more likely he will regret starting this war.
US funding for Kyiv is still stuck in Congress. The White House message to President Zelenskyy today, be patient.
There's bipartisan support in both houses of Congress for a deal, for supporting Ukraine. We need to get it done. And the Ukrainians, they're nervous, but they believe that we will get it done.
The European Union is planning to provide 82 billion Australian dollars to Kyiv over 4 years. But the Hungarian Prime Minister is standing in the way, believing such a sum would damage the EU budget.
Ukrán ügy és költségvetés a magyar fejben két különböző dolog.
Viktor Orbán now has a friend in Robert Fico, Slovakia's new Prime Minister.
My sme si veľmi pozorne vypočuli návrhy, ktoré chce predložiť, alebo už predložil pán predseda vlády v súvislosti s revíziou rozpočtu a pomoci Ukrajine. A zopakujem, že ich považujeme za racionálne a zmysluplné.
EU leaders indicated they are looking at ways to act, even if Hungary uses its veto.
Ukrainians need predictable financing throughout 2024 and beyond. They need a sustained supply of weapons to defend Ukraine and regain its rightful territory.
In Russian-controlled Donetsk, Putin's United Russia Party is gathering signatures ahead of March's presidential election. Holding a vote in these occupied regions of Ukraine is part of the Kremlin's effort to show they have been integrated into Russia. President Putin warning the West the territorial gains it has made cannot be reversed.
А что касается вот этого переговорного процесса, попытка побудить нас отказаться от тех завоеваний, которые мы реализовали за последние 1,5 года. Но это невозможно. Все понимают, что это невозможно. И они, правящие круги в Украине, понимают. И западные элиты понимают. Все понимают.
President Zelenskyy says the conflict must not become frozen on current lines because it will eventually reignite.
Putin is a predator who is not satisfied with the frozen products.
His message at this meeting of financial heavyweights: the more you invest in Ukraine, the sooner the war will end. But the money Kyiv needs remains far from guaranteed. Ben Lewis, SBS World News.
Olympic cyclist Melissa Hoskins is being laid to rest in her home city of Fremantle. The 32-year-old mother of 2 died late last year after being hit by a car outside her home in Adelaide. Ms Hoskins was a world champion cyclist and represented Australia at the 2012 and 2016 Olympics. Her husband and fellow Australian cyclist Rowan Dennis has been charged in connection with her death. A memorial service for her will also be held in Adelaide after the Tour Down Under. An attempt to film an aerobatic manoeuvre has been blamed for a fatal mid-air collision between 2 jet trainer aircraft above Port Phillip Bay in Victoria last year. The aviation safety watchdog's preliminary findings reveal how one jet tried to pass underneath the other as that plane flew upside down after the move was described as a good filming opportunity. The collision taking place when the jets veered too close together. The jet, with a pilot and cameraman on board, lost control, impacting the water, killing both. The driver of a deadly bus crash in New South Wales Hunter region last year has been hit with 26 additional charges. The 58-year-old was already charged with 18 offences over the incident, which left 10 people dead and 25 hospitalised. He's now facing an additional 10 counts of manslaughter and 16 counts of furious driving causing bodily harm. He didn't appear in court today but was represented by his lawyer who made no comment. The holidays are almost over, and with school returning in less than a fortnight, that only means one thing. The back-to-school shop has begun, but the pressure of paying for it has left some parents struggling amid rising cost of living.
It's essential but often stressful. Preparing the shop for school supplies is something Year 8 student Marielle and her mum are used to. But this year the list is long.
I'm struggling to pay my fees to private school for my daughter, and also for paying for stationery, laptops, iPad, and this is a necessary things to have it in the private school.
And the Yalda household is not alone.
We recently surveyed over 2,000 of the families that we support. What's most concerning is that 9 out of 10 of the families that we surveyed were particularly concerned about the start of this school year.
Half of those families worried about their ability to afford back-to-school essentials. That's up 20% from last year. The survey comes as new data reveals just how expensive the 2024 school year could be. Nationwide, school costs account for $12.9 billion of spending. Basic supplies like textbooks, stationery and a uniform will set parents back more than $600 for primary school-aged children and upwards of $1,000 for high schoolers each year. Electronic devices adding to that cost. Factor in tuition fees, excursions, sporting equipment and transport, and the spend soars.
Private school costs and fees, I think, have gone up 10% this year. In our case, for 2 kids, that makes a really big difference.
Because we're tightening our budget just across the board, there's other things that we miss out on.
For families experiencing extreme hardship, experts suggest reaching out to the school or local charities and to shop second-hand. They're also urging people to steer clear of taking out any loans to avoid facing further financial difficulty.
Try and avoid those high interest payday loan type lending facilities, because they can be a really easy way to get into financial trouble.
An important lesson in back to school economics. Francesca Danuccio, SBS World News.
As artificial intelligence becomes further embedded in daily life, the Australian government is considering introducing mandatory guardrails to help mitigate some of the risks. SBS Finance Editor Ricardo Gonçalves joins me now with more. Ricardo, legislative changes aren't out of the question.
Yeah, Catalina, the government is looking to regulate artificial intelligence, but not as much as others around the world. It acknowledges the potential for AI to help improve well-being and quality of life, while adding $600 billion annually to the economy by 2030.
From robots to chatbots, the use of artificial intelligence is quickly becoming part of everyday life.
The fact that you're not receiving lots of spam email is because there are AI filters that do that task. The fact that Netflix offers you some fun movies to watch that appeal to you is because there's an AI that's doing that.
The government now stepping up to confront public concerns over the possible risk of these technologies without limiting their potential.
We know that there's huge economic benefit to be gained. We don't want to stifle that innovation. You can still regulate and innovate.
The government says it wants to see low-risk uses of the technology continue to flourish. Those include AI-enabled chatbots, personalised shopping recommendations and spam email filters. While higher-risk technologies such as self-driving cars, programs assessing job applications or AI-powered robots used in medical surgery are likely to face stricter regulations. Australia is closely monitoring how other countries are responding to the challenges of AI, including in the US and Canada, but says it's not considering the introduction of a restrictive AI Act, like in the European Union.
While legislative changes are still being considered, the government is working with industries to introduce immediate actions, including developing AI safety standards, watermarking AI-generated materials, and establishing an advisory body.
But some experts say Australia risks missing the boat.
I think that for many years there was this feeling that you couldn't and you shouldn't regulate the tech space. You couldn't because somehow it was different, it wasn't physical, and you shouldn't because that was going to stifle innovation. Well, I think we're discovering quite the opposite. You can and you should.
The government has committed $41.2 million to support the responsible deployment of AI. Achola Rock, SBS World News.
Well, petrol prices may climb as attacks in the Red Sea continue to escalate. Around 6.5% of the world's oil is transported through the waterway, but there are now reports British and oil gas giant Shell may be the latest to halt shipments there, although it would not confirm those reports with SBS. It follows similar decisions recently by Qatar Energy and BP, which will force them to make a longer alternative route around Africa, adding to costs. The Brent crude price is actually down on the same time yesterday and in fact is flat on the month because the attacks aren't impacting supply or production, rather adding to the costs of transporting oil, which may be passed on to motorists, refuelling inflation fears.
But whether it's substantial enough to change some of the policy settings that we have central banks around the world, I think it'll depend for how long this lasts. So that's something that we're watching very closely. But right now, it's just something that I think the market for now is considering as a temporary blip.
Vivek Dar says the recent delays may flow through to petrol prices in a month's time. Global central banks, meanwhile, are continuing to warn that interest rates may not fall as fast as many had been expecting, strengthening the US dollar and weakening the Australian currency as a result. It declined again today to be at a fresh 5-month low and since the beginning of the month has lost more than 3%. Overnight, a US Federal Reserve official said interest rate cuts there shouldn't be rushed because its economy and labour market is in good shape, while lower commodity prices have also hit our currency as China's economy grows less than expected.
The Chinese GDP rate of growth for year on year is 5.2%. Sounds big when you talk about developed economies, but China is still a developing economy. It's the lowest rate of growth since the 1990s. Outside of the coronavirus period, but 5.2% is still reasonably good, but I think expectations were a bit higher.
China's population, meanwhile, fell for a second consecutive year in 2023, down nearly 2.1 million to 1.409 billion people. It saw a wave of COVID-19 related deaths as its strict lockdowns ended, along with a record low birth rate. And the weakness in the Australian dollar continues against the US as it comes as economists at NAB change their view on local interest rates, rubbing out their prediction of one final rate rise. The Australian share market was also down, with the ASX 200 closing 0.3% weaker. The energy sector was the worst performing, while gold stocks also took a hit. Healthcare did well though, along with the insurers. And there are concerns Australia isn't building enough new homes to meet the government's housing targets. The Bureau of Statistics says just over 23,000 new houses were being constructed in the September quarter. That's the weakest result in over a decade. Apartments also slowed to an 11-year low with just under 14,000. The housing industry of Australia blames rapid rate rises, higher costs, skill shortages and government red tape for the shortfall.
Our current forecasts suggest that over the next 5 years, we'll struggle to commence 1 million houses across the country, and the government wants to see 1.2 million. So we're going to fall well short of that unless there are some significant policy changes that actually make it easier and more affordable to build housing.
The HIA says higher interest rates and construction costs, along with taxes and land supply restrictions, are all contributing to the slowdown. Tomorrow, more data from the Bureau, which will help guide the RBA in its next interest rates decision. Catalina, that is the official jobs numbers.
OK, look forward to it. Thank you so much, Ricardo. Well, more than 3 months since Australians rejected the Indigenous voice to Parliament, where is Australia at in terms of marking January 26, one of the most contentious days in our history? For migrants, citizenship ceremonies on January 26 continue to be popular, but there is a shift away from this day being one for new Australians to become naturalised.
Just a few months after a resounding majority of the Australian population voted against an Indigenous voice to Parliament, the country remains divided on how to celebrate Australia and whether the celebration should be on January 26, one of the most contentious dates in the nation's history. Today, the Australia Day Council of New South Wales held a launch party where it was clear there's been a shift in tone.
We're reflecting on 65,000 years of tradition. We're respecting each other and we're celebrating the great country that we have become.
January 26 is still being touted by the government as a day to celebrate, with citizenship ceremonies welcoming new Australians still a focal point for communities across the country. But there is change in the water. The City of Fremantle Council in Western Australia voted yes in the referendum and has now made a call to scrap its citizenship ceremonies on January 26.
We've always led the way, I think, in this conversation, and we're a proudly progressive community. So we're glad we have the opportunity to reflect the sentiments of our community, which is that January the 26th is not the appropriate day for celebration.
But for one of the largest citizenship ceremonies in the country, the Blacktown City Council in Sydney is sticking by its usual date. We will acknowledge Australia Day and our new Australian citizens on this date and note that the 26th of January is still officially gazetted as Australia Day. We believe that it is a day we welcome our most recent arrivals and acknowledge our First Nations people. The decision to change or keep the 26th of January as a key date for citizenship ceremonies largely comes down to councils, who are responsible for holding the ceremonies, beginning to engage with their constituents.
It's a reflection of how local councils are engaging with the local community, strangely enough, and the way I think some of the councils and the local communities are changing is about how they have engaged in a meaningful way with their local communities, First Nations and all nations in their community.
Diana Damjanovic, SBS World News.
Coming up next, with waterholes drying up, conservationists are warning of more elephant deaths in Zimbabwe amid drought conditions. And the tennis team who's gone from cuddling snakes to causing a shock at the Australian Open. In one of Zimbabwe's largest national parks, the effects of drought have killed at least 100 elephants. The park has seen more heat as well as less rain over the years, and conservationists are warning of more elephant deaths across the region, and are warning the images may be distressing for some viewers.
Yet another elephant carcass. Grim discoveries like this have become familiar for rangers in Zimbabwe's Hwange National Park. They estimate that more than 100 died between October and November as the drought intensified. But the vastness of the park makes it difficult to have a proper count. Park authorities are worried about the deaths.
It's a painful situation. As a conservationist, my wish is to see these animals continuing to survive or to thrive in the system, so that the future generation can be able to see these animals, and we can also continue to benefit from the ecosystem services that we are provided by this wildlife and also these animals.
The water holes are drying up, meaning there is not enough for all the animals. Elephants need to drink a lot. An adult requires about 200 litres of water per day. But with low supply, some animals are forced to travel long distances to get to find enough to drink. This park occupies 14,000 square kilometers, but it does not have a major river that runs through it. About 104 solar-powered boreholes supply this park with water. But with the frequent droughts and heat, the water table is going down. Mammals like elephants are suffering the most. Conservation groups like the International Fund for Animal Welfare are assisting with funding for solar wells in the park. But they believe the long-term solution is for wildlife to be put high on the climate change agenda.
Animals are not only victims, but also our partners, in that they are critical as they promote the generation of forests across landscapes. These landscapes then act as carbon sinks that are critical in climate change.
While the climate change debate rages on, decisions that the world will make are bound to determine the future of these animals. Conservationists like Daphne can only hope for a better environment for the elephants to thrive.
And that was Privilege Musvaneri with that story. Alex de Minaur has strolled into the third round of the Australian Open. On a day of surprise results, the Demon made it look easy in his latest match.
Thousands of fans roaring his entrance to the Rod Laver Arena, and many more across the country. Alex de Minaur is learning to shoulder a nation's expectations as well as his own. He broke serve as early as the third game and was never behind after that.
But there's the break, didn't do enough with the volley.
His 22-year-old Italian opponent, Matteo Arnaldi, making his Australian Open debut, didn't win a single game in the second set. De Minaur winning this round 2 match in exactly 2 hours.
And it's a demolition by the Demon.
I thought I just had to be solid here, use the crowd, try to stay focused, and I'm very happy to get the win today, so thank you guys.
There was a huge shock in the women's singles as 16-year-old Mira Andreeva knocked out 6-seed Ons Jabeur.
Wow, that was flawless. That was simply stunning. 6-love.
The Siberian-born teenager who lives in Cannes in France, steamrollering a player with 5 WTA titles to her name, who has reached Grand Slam finals at Wimbledon and the US Open. It took Andreeva less than an hour to win 6-love, 6-2.
And that will do it. What a performance from the 16-year-old.
12 months ago, she was winning the Junior Australian Open.
I am a bit more mature than I was before. You're only 16. Oh, that's true, but last year I was 15, and so in this year I think I changed a lot, and I think you can see that on the court.
Andreeva's highlight of the week has been meeting some Aussie wildlife. Now she's the predator stalking the rest of the field. Alex Thomas, SBS World News.
Another surprising result in the women's singles saw 2018 champion Caroline Wozniacki lose to a qualifier. The world's top doubles player Storm Hunter is through to round 3 in the singles for the first time. And there were straight sets wins for title contenders Coco Gauff and, in the men's draw, Yannick Sinner. For the third year running, it's First Nations Day at the Australian Open. Yvonne Goolagong-Cawley taking part exactly 50 years on from the first of her 4 singles titles.
Indigenous excellence for the whole world to see. Tennis fans braving the Melbourne rain for a day dedicated to culture.
For us as Aboriginal people, it is such an honour to have us being celebrated on the world stage and showcasing who we are and what we're about.
Spectators and visitors from around the world also took part in a smoking ceremony, and Wurundjeri elder Auntie Joy Murphy conducted a welcome to country. Meanwhile, Indigenous kids began the morning with a hit on Margaret Court Arena, many of them taking part in programs at the Yvonne Goolagong Foundation.
It's all about keeping the kids in school. We're using tennis as a vehicle to create better education and health.
The Wiradjuri tennis legend celebrating 50 years since she claimed victory in the Australian Open for the first time.
50, yeah. Oh, God. When I first heard that, 50 years, suddenly it made me feel old. I am old, I'm 72, but you know, how time flies. I must have been having a good time because 50 years just went like that.
A trailblazer smashing open barriers for First Nations people for more than half a century. Cameron Gooley, SBS World News.
Steve Smith has made an underwhelming start to life as an opening batter. Picked to replace David Warner at the top of the order, Smith did hit a couple of fours on the opening day of the first test in Adelaide, but he was caught behind for just 12 runs as Australia reached 2 for 59 by stumps. Earlier, the West Indies were bowled out for 188. Pat Covens and Josh Hazlewood each taking 4 wickets.
I love playing here. As you mentioned, whether it's pink or red ball, I think there's always something in the wicket if you just snag away there in the right area. You don't have to bowl too quick. You just hang around off stump there, occasional bounce. That's pretty simple, but you're sort of getting rewards here, I think.
It's been almost 20 years since José Mourinho famously declared himself a special one, but his managerial future is in question after being sacked by Roma. He was at the Italian club for 18 months. Mourinho led Roma to victory in the 2022 UEFA Conference Final, but that's the only trophy he has won in the last 6 years. Between 2003 and 2017, he lifted 20 major trophies at Porto, Chelsea, Real Madrid and Manchester United. There's been another surprising result at the Africa Cup of Nations. Namibia ranked 115th in the world, beating the 2004 champions Tunisia. The only goal of the game coming as late as the 88th minute. Tunisia is the third highest ranked team in the tournament. And one of rugby's brightest young stars is leaving the sport to try American football instead. 22-year-old Louise Rees-Zammit has scored 14 tries for Wales and is known as Rees Lightning because of his speed. But he'll miss the forthcoming Six Nations after deciding to join the NFL's international player pathway. Coming up next, the weather and how long do we have until the world's biggest iceberg disappears? To the weather forecast, a band of cloud will extend from the Northern Territory through New South Wales to the Victorian coastline with potentially heavy rain. And a tropical low that has developed off Cairns is set to become a cyclone in the Coral Sea by Monday, with a chance of tracking back to the far north coast. In the major centres, possible showers across Sydney, sunny in Canberra, becoming windy and partly cloudy in Melbourne, showers increasing in Hobart and partly cloudy in Perth, showers and possible storms in Darwin, a shower or two for Brisbane. Looking further afield now, thunderstorms in Nandi, showers for Port Vila and partly cloudy for Auckland. In Southeast Asia, partly cloudy in Phnom Penh, thunderstorms for Kuala Lumpur and Singapore. Further north now, fine in Beijing, cloudy for Tokyo and drizzle in Shanghai, partly cloudy in Hong Kong. Heading west, partly cloudy in Beirut, fine in Baghdad and partly cloudy in Islamabad, fog in New Delhi. To Europe, snow in Stockholm, Moscow and Warsaw, fine in London and snow for Paris. In Africa, cloudy in Algiers, cloudy also in Lagos and showers in Nairobi, thunderstorms for Johannesburg. In South America, partly cloudy in Caracas, cloudy too for Bogota and Lima and showers for Buenos Aires. And for North America, snow in Vancouver, fog for Los Angeles, cloudy for Mexico City. Erosion is carving dramatic features into the world's biggest iceberg in what's likely to be the final months of its existence. The iceberg, known as A23A, is being ground down by the warmer air and water it's encountering as it drifts slowly away from the Antarctic. But it's not seen as a consequence of climate change, and as it melts, it will have benefits.
After 3 decades confined to the freezer in Antarctica, A23A is on the move, travelling north into warmer waters. The berg is now melting, and fast. An expedition this week saw waves gouging huge caves and arches in its walls. Only A23A's enormous scale is keeping it in existence. Satellite images show the frozen block to have a width of 65 kilometres or 40 miles. That's like the distance from Manchester to Sheffield. A23A has an area of 3,900 square kilometres. That's more than twice the size of Greater London. And its average thickness is about 280 metres, nearly as tall as the Eiffel Tower, and it weighs close to 1 trillion tonnes. But these dimensions are shrinking all the time.
Now that it's moved off from its relatively cooler position in the southern area of the Weddell Sea, it's being exposed to much warmer water temperatures, much stronger currents, and much warmer air temperatures as well. So all of these forces will combine to attack the integrity of that iceberg, and it will eventually begin to carve off and break up into smaller pieces.
The production and melting of these big icebergs is part of a natural cycle, not an obvious consequence of climate change. And as this one melts, there are upsides. It'll be dropping mineral dust in the ocean. This is a fertiliser, stimulating the growth of the very smallest organisms like plankton, all the way up to the biggest creatures on the planet, the blue whales. A23A may eventually wither to nothing, but its legacy will be long felt.
Jonathan Amos with that report. Recapping our top stories now. A deal has been brokered by Qatar to provide medicines for hostages held in Gaza by Hamas. In return, Israel will allow more basic supplies into Gaza. It comes as Foreign Minister Penny Wong visits Israel on her Middle East tour. China's ambassador to Australia has called for a resumption of joint military exercises with Australia, declaring 2024 should be the year of deeper economic and strategic ties. But tensions in the relationship remain, in particular over Taiwan. In a major departure from previous summits, North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un says unification of the Korean peninsula is no longer possible. And new data reveals just how expensive the 2024 school year could be, with estimates that nationwide school costs account for $12.9 billion of spending. That is the world this Wednesday. Rochelle Harrison-Pless will be back with our next bulletin at 10:25. Thank you for your company. I'm Catalina Florez from the team. Good night.